He wasn't just a steel magnate. He was the man who built an empire of flesh and blood. 31 wives, 89 children. A dynasty born of obsession, not love. What happens when family becomes a factory? Stay with me as we uncover America's most disturbing legacy. If you enjoy uncovering history's secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. And tell me in the comments if you'd survive in such a house. In the late 19th century, America was a land of iron, coal, and ambition. Railroads stitched the nation together, factories belched black smoke into the skies, and men who could tame steel rose to the heights of kings. Among them stood one figure who seemed to outshine and outshadow the rest. His name was Edwin Hargrave, though history would remember him less for the bridges and furnaces he built, and more for the disturbing family empire he left behind. Edwin's beginnings were not unlike the fables America adored. A poor boy from Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, born into soot and sweat. He grew up listening to the ring of hammer on anvil, learning early that power belonged not to the man with gentle hands, but to the one who could bend iron to his will. By the age of 20, Edwin had already left his father's forge, chasing bigger fire steel furnaces in Pittsburgh, mines in West Virginia, investors in New York who whispered about fortunes made overnight. He was clever, ruthless, and tireless. Where others hesitated, Edwin risked everything. He made deals with bankers who despised him, struck bargains with railroad men who cursed his name, and undercut rivals until they were ruined. He was not the richest magnate of his day. Others, like Carnegie or Rockefeller, held greater sums. But Edwin possessed something they lacked, a hunger not just for profit, but for possession. That hunger shaped everything he touched. In business, it drove him to scoop up factories, mills, and shipping contracts as though they were trinkets. But in his private life, it expressed itself in ways far stranger, far darker. To Edwin, people just like machines were assets. Wives were investments. Children were proof of his dominion. A family was not a tender thing to be cherished. It was an empire to be expanded. Contemporaries described Edwin as tall and commanding, with a hawk's gaze that made men uneasy. He was rarely seen smiling. Portraits of him show a stern man in a dark suit, his eyes like steel bolts driven into anyone who looked too long. He spoke little in public, letting his wealth and influence speak for him. But behind closed doors, his voice was law. Those who disobeyed, whether in his mills or in his home, learned quickly that Hargrave's punishments were as cold as his furnaces. Edwin's first marriage seemed ordinary enough. He wed a local woman, the daughter of a merchant, when he was just 24. By then he already had the beginnings of his steel contracts. The union gave him legitimacy, respectability, and soon after, his first child. Yet Edwin was never satisfied. Within a few years, a second marriage followed, then a third. Some were whispered to have taken place quietly in distant towns, others arranged under religious or cultural justifications. What shocked society was not just the number, but the speed. By his mid-30s, Edwin was rumored to have half a dozen wives scattered across Pennsylvania and Ohio. Many powerful men in that era were unfaithful, but Edwin's case was different. This was not infidelity, it was expansion. Each wife, in his mind, was another branch in his growing dynasty. Each child was another heir to bear the Hargrave name, another piece of living evidence that his empire stretched beyond steel into flesh and blood. By the time newspapers began to hint at his unusual household, Edwin was already untouchable. His mills employed thousands. His name was tied to contracts that supplied railroads stretching across half the nation, and politicians relied on his donations to secure their elections. When whispers grew louder, they were silenced with money, influence, or fear. In public, he remained the steel magnate who helped build America. In private, he was crafting something else, something more sinister. This was the paradox of Edwin Hargrave. To the world, he was a titan of industry, a man who forged progress out of iron. But to those closest to him, wives living in guarded estates, children scattered across towns like hidden embers, he was not just a father or a husband. He was the architect of a disturbing vision. That family could be manufactured like steel beams, hammered into place and multiplied without limit. And so, as his empire of smoke and iron grew higher, so too did his secret empire of wives and children. An empire that would one day surpass even his steel fortune in size. Scandal and sorrow. To understand Edwin Hargrave's family empire, you have to forget what most people mean when they say family. For him, wives were not chosen for love. They were acquired, negotiated, sometimes even absorbed, the way a company might purchase a rival. Marriage, in his mind, was simply another business transaction, one that could expand his reach far beyond the walls of his mills. His second wife was not the product of romance, but of calculation. She was the daughter of a landowner whose property held rich deposits of coal, the very fuel Edwin needed to feed his furnaces. By marrying her, he gained not only a bride, but access to her family's resources. His third wife came from a family of railmen whose lines transported his steel. Each marriage linked him deeper into networks of power. He saw it not as scandal, but as strategy. But unlike his business ventures, these unions did not remain hidden in ledgers. They produced children, dozens of them. Each time a new wife was added, another household had to be built, another estate staffed with servants, another cluster of children raised under his stern rules. Some were given fine houses in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, others tucked away in rural estates, where their presence would raise fewer questions. To outsiders, these households looked like wealthy family homes. But to those inside, they were pieces of a greater machine, overseen by the same man who treated mills, wives, and children as interchangeable assets. Edwin demanded obedience. Wives were expected to remain loyal, silent, and productive. Rumors swirled that he set schedules for them, who would visit him on which nights, which wife would bear the next child, who was falling behind in their duty to the Hargrave name. Some resisted, but resistance rarely lasted. A disobedient wife could find herself cast aside, her children neglected, her position erased. More often, however, fear kept them in line. Edwin's wealth provided security, but it came at the cost of freedom. The world outside his homes began to whisper. A businessman could take mistresses, but multiple simultaneous marriages were harder to hide. Priests denounced him from pulpits, accusing him of mocking God's law. Newspapers printed sly pieces hinting at his unconventional household. Yet for every article that appeared, another journalist found themselves silenced with a generous donation or a threat of ruined reputation. Edwin Hargrave, after all, wasn't just another man, he was a pillar of industry. To expose him was to risk destroying the prosperity of entire towns that relied on his mills. Still, his obsession only grew. By the 1880s, Edwin was rumored to have more than a dozen wives spread across multiple states. Some were legally married to him. Others were bound by private vows or spiritual covenants he claimed were above earthly law. Whatever the arrangement, each new wife expanded his influence and, inevitably, his brood of children. For the wives themselves, life was complicated. Some enjoyed wealth and privilege, dressed in the latest fashions, their homes filled with imported furniture. Yet beneath the luxury lay a suffocating reality. They were never truly wives, but partners in a vast, unsettling experiment. They compared notes, whispered behind closed doors, some forming bonds of secret sisterhood against the man who ruled them all. Others turned bitter, jealous of the newer, younger women who replaced them in Edwin's favor. The children, too, felt the consequences. In this section of the tale, they are still young, scattered across households, unaware of just how vast their father's family truly was. But already rivalry sparked. Who was the favorite? Which mother's children received more gifts, better tutors, finer clothes? Even among the very young, divisions ran deep planted by a father who viewed them less as sons and daughters, and more as heirs and proofs of his legacy. By now, Edwin Hargrave's empire was no longer only made of steel. It was made of flesh and blood, multiplied and arranged according to his vision. He had taken the cold logic of business expansion and applied it to marriage itself, forging a family not through love or tradition, but through acquisition. And like any empire built on ruthless expansion, cracks were already beginning to show. If Edwin Hargrave's 31 wives were the foundation stones of his private empire, then his children were its towering columns, 89 of them, scattered across towns, estates, and schools. To the outside world, they appeared as the sprawling branches of a proud dynasty. But inside that empire, the children lived vastly different lives depending on where they fell in their father's hierarchy. Some were raised in privilege. The eldest sons of his first wives were groomed like little princes, dressed in fine suits, given private tutors, and paraded before guests as proof of the Hargrave legacy. Edwin spoke of them with pride, boasting of their sharp minds and steel blood. These children were told from the cradle that they would inherit their father's empire, not just the mills and factories, but the responsibility of carrying on his name. But for every favored child, there were many more who lived in shadows. Some grew up in remote countryside homes, far from the public eye, with only a governess or resentful stepmother to raise them. A few were said to have been deliberately hidden offspring of unions that Edwin kept secret, tucked away to avoid scandal. These children bore the Hargrave name, but rarely saw the man who had sired them. To them, their father was more myth than man, a figure they glimpsed only when he visited their household, once or twice a year. In such an empire, rivalry was inevitable. Children of different mothers competed constantly for their father's attention. Did your mother still please him? Did she bear him more children than the others? Did you receive a gift from him last Christmas, or had he forgotten you? The smallest privileges, a better seat at the dining table, a new pair of boots, a ride in the carriage, became weapons in a quiet war that never ended. Edwin encouraged it, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps deliberately. He never treated his children as equals. He divided them into categories: heirs, assets, and afterthoughts. He expected brilliance from a select few, while the rest were to serve as proof of his fertility, his dominance, his ability to multiply himself across generations. Those who disappointed him were met with cold silence, sometimes banishment to boarding schools where they were forgotten. The psychological toll was immense. Some of the older children grew resentful, questioning why their father needed so many heirs when one would have sufficed. Others internalized his lessons, becoming cruel, competitive, or desperate for scraps of approval. In later years, many would confess that they felt fatherless, even in a house full of siblings. They lived in the shadow of a man who believed he owned them, but who never truly knew them. And yet, a few children loved him. Or at least, they believed they did. They admired his strength, his wealth, his unshakable authority. To them, Edwin was larger than life, a titan who had forged not only steel, but their very existence. These children became his loyal defenders, parroting his words, ready to inherit his empire without question. Their devotion only deepened the divide, sharpening the resentment of siblings who felt abandoned. Outside the Hargrave homes, whispers spread. Townsfolk spoke of children who appeared at church one Sunday and vanished the next, of new faces bearing the Hargrave look, his sharp eyes, his dark hair popping up in schools across Pennsylvania. Teachers reported that Hargrave children often carried themselves with arrogance, quick to mention their father's wealth. Others noted that some arrived at school malnourished, withdrawn, or unable to explain why they lived in sprawling houses without ever seeing their parents. It wasn't long before tragedy touched the brood. A daughter who fled one of the estates was later found destitute in another city. A son, desperate to outshine his siblings, drank himself into an early grave before the age of 20. These were stories Edwin dismissed as weakness, but they became cracks in the facade of his dynasty. For every bright success, he produced a lawyer, a doctor, a manager for his mills. There were 2 others who fell into scandal, rebellion, or despair. 89 children. To Edwin, they were living monuments, the proof of his willpower and dominance. To each other, they were rivals, half-strangers, sometimes enemies. And to history, they became the greatest symbol of his obsession. An empire of blood as unstable as it was vast. But even as the children grew restless, even as society whispered of the strange, sprawling Hargrave clan, Edwin remained unmoved. He saw the cracks, but he believed his empire would endure. What he did not see, or refused to admit, was that empires, whether built of steel or of flesh, can only bear so much weight before they begin to collapse. To the world beyond his gates, Edwin Hargrave was a titan of progress. His name appeared in newspapers beside words like visionary, builder, and patriot. Politicians toasted him at banquets, praising his steel for the railroads that stitched America together. Photographs captured him standing tall at factory openings, top hat in hand, his sharp features frozen in dignified pride. School books in some Pennsylvania towns even included lines about Hargrave steel, branding it as a symbol of modern America. But this was only one face of the man, behind closed doors. In the labyrinth of estates and homes that sheltered his 31 wives and 89 children, another story was unfolding. A story whispered by servants, carried on hushed gossip through kitchen doors, and overheard by neighbors who lived close enough to see flickers of oddity in the Hargrave household. Servants spoke of rules strict, unyielding, and sometimes cruel. Wives were not permitted to leave the estate without permission. Children were forbidden from speaking during meals unless addressed. Laughter was rare. Silence was law. Some claimed Edwin kept a ledger for his household, much like he kept for his steel mills, marking down which wife bore which child, and whether they were producing according to his expectations. Neighbors recalled strange sights, children walking in line across the yard, their heads down as if rehearsing some unspoken drill. Late-night carriages arriving with women who vanished into the mansion, never to be seen again in town. On more than one occasion, visitors swore they heard weeping echoing from shuttered windows in the middle of the night. For his wives, life could be both gilded and suffocating. In public, they wore fine gowns and jewels, escorted to church or civic events where they smiled politely beside the great man. But behind those smiles lay exhaustion and despair. Rivalries between wives turned poisonous, each struggling for favor, terrified of falling out of Edwin's graces. Stories spread of women locked in their rooms for defiance, of quarrels hushed by threats, of young brides barely out of girlhood thrust into a life they could not escape, and the children, so many children, bore the brunt of this hidden reality. Teachers quietly confided that Hargrave offspring were either startlingly brilliant or deeply troubled, with no middle ground. Some boys strutted about, repeating their father's harsh words as if they were gospel. Others sat silent in classrooms, unable to meet anyone's eyes, haunted by a childhood that looked orderly from the outside but felt oppressive within. Society, of course, began to take notice. By the 1890s, rumors about Edwin's sprawling family could no longer be ignored. Editorials hinted at unconventional domestic arrangements. Ministers thundered from pulpits, condemning him as a man of sin, hiding behind wealth. But the more the whispers spread, the more Edwin doubled down on his carefully crafted image. He donated heavily to churches, hospitals, and schools, ensuring his name was etched on plaques and cornerstones. He invited journalists to tour his steel mills, dazzling them with the scale of his operations. He hosted galas where his most presentable wives appeared at his side, smiling like porcelain figures. To the public eye, Edwin Hargrave was not a monster, he was a benefactor, a symbol of American progress. The contradiction was staggering. On one hand, he was the man who built jobs for thousands, who donated libraries to small towns, who stood beside senators and governors in photographs. On the other, he was a patriarch of a sprawling, secretive household built on fear, competition, and control. Those who dared to speak of the private horror were often silenced. A newspaper in Ohio once prepared a scathing expose about his wives and children, scattered across estates like livestock. Before it could be printed, the editor withdrew the story. Days later, Hargrave Steel announced a lucrative partnership with the paper's largest advertiser. Coincidence or intimidation? Few doubted which dot, and yet, for all his money and influence, the cracks were widening. Servants left their posts, carrying whispers into nearby towns. Some wives, weary of silence, began to confide in priests. Children grew restless, older sons resentful of their father's control, daughters desperate to escape the shadow of his name. Public image is a fortress, but no fortress is unbreakable. Behind Edwin Hargrave's mask of respectability, the seeds of scandal had already been sown. It was only a matter of time before the private horror began to spill into the open, staining the legacy he had fought so hard to polish. By the final years of the 19th century, Edwin Hargrave's carefully built empire of steel and of family began to tremble under its own weight. The man who once seemed untouchable now found himself surrounded by whispers, lawsuits, and betrayals, most of them born not from his business rivals, but from the very people who shared his blood dot. It started with inheritance disputes. As Edwin aged, his health weakened, and the question of succession became unavoidable. 31 wives and 89 children meant dozens of competing claims. The eldest sons insisted they were the rightful heirs, boasting of their superior education and their father's early promises. But younger wives demanded equal recognition for their children, refusing to let their offspring be cast aside. Lawyers soon filled his mansion, drafting wills, redrafting them, and filing suits in anticipation of the inevitable battle. The courts, too, struggled to make sense of the Hargrave family. Judges questioned the legality of his multiple marriages, some of which had never been properly recorded. Clergymen condemned him as a bigamist. Politicians who once praised his philanthropy now distanced themselves, wary of being dragged into scandal. His vast fortune, once seen as a symbol of progress, was now entangled in a web of domestic chaos. But the greatest cracks came not from the law, but from inside his home. The children, grown older and bolder, began to rebel. Some refused to work in his mills, pursuing lives of their own. Others turned to drink, gambling, or scandalous affairs. Their names splashed across newspapers that delighted in exposing the rot behind Hargrave's polished image. Rivalries turned violent. There were fistfights between half-brothers at public gatherings, bitter arguments among sisters over inheritance, even whispered rumors of attempted poisonings within the household. One of Edwin's most promising sons, groomed to take over the steel works, shocked society by denouncing his father publicly. Standing in a crowded courthouse, he declared that Edwin had built not a family, but a factory of misery, producing children without love or guidance. His words spread like wildfire, fueling the press and emboldening others to speak out. For the first time, Edwin's public image began to collapse under the weight of undeniable truth. Business rivals seized the opportunity. Competitors who had long envied Hargrave Steel began leaking stories to the press, exposing the strange, sprawling household and portraying Edwin as both immoral and unstable. Investors grew cautious. Contracts slipped away. Newspapers once bought by his donations now published biting editorials calling him the Baron of Averin, Flesh, the great magnate who had silenced criticism for decades, suddenly found himself unable to control the narrative. Inside his estates, the wives turned on each other with ferocity. Some demanded greater shares of inheritance. Others accused their rivals of manipulation. Secret alliances formed and broke, sisters-in-law turning enemies overnight. Priests reported late-night confessions from women who spoke of abuse, isolation, and despair within the Hargrave homes. The household, once tightly controlled, became a battlefield. And through it all, Edwin himself grew more paranoid. He stopped appearing at public functions, fearing ridicule. He tightened his grip on the wives and children who remained obedient, locking down estates, restricting movement, and surrounding himself with loyal guards. But no amount of control could stop the empire from unraveling. The more he tried to silence the chaos, the louder it became. By the dawn of the new century, Edwin Hargrave was no longer celebrated as a visionary. He was whispered about as a cautionary tale. His steel empire, though still formidable, was overshadowed by his family scandals. Every lawsuit, every rebellion, every betrayal chipped away at his once impenetrable fortress. The cracks in the dynasty were now too deep to ignore. And as Edwin's health continued to decline, everyone from his wives to his children to his enemies prepared for the inevitable, the fall of the man who thought he could forge not just steel, but a dynasty of flesh and blood. When Edwin Hargrave finally drew his last breath, the world outside his gates paused only briefly. Newspapers announced the death of a titan, a man who had forged America's backbone in steel. Editorials praised his contributions to railroads, bridges, and factories. Politicians issued statements mourning a great benefactor. For a moment, it seemed his legacy might survive UNTARNISHED. But inside the Hargrave household, the news of his death did not bring mourning. It ignited war. The very morning after his passing, lawyers began arriving in black carriages, summoned by wives and children, desperate to secure their place in the inheritance. 31 women claimed the title of widow. 89 children, legitimate or not, demanded recognition as heirs. Courtrooms swelled with the chaos of petitions, counter-petitions, accusations of fraud, and even threats of violence. Judges faced the impossible task of sorting through marriages that were dubious at best, illegal at worst. Was Edwin truly married to all these women? Which unions counted under the law? Which children had rights to his fortune, and which would be cast aside as bastards? What followed was one of the most scandalous legal battles of its age. Newspapers reported every twist with delight. The widows of Hargrave glaring at one another across the courtroom, the sons who stormed out when told they would receive nothing, the daughters who wept as lawyers questioned their legitimacy. The empire Edwin had built so carefully was laid bare in public, its hypocrisies and horrors dissected for all to see. The wealth at stake was staggering. Hargrave Steel remained profitable, but his personal fortune, mansions, land, investments, was tangled in claims. Rival lawyers argued over wills that contradicted each other, some clearly written under duress. One will named a single wife as his true spouse, cutting out all others. Another, drafted years later, attempted to divide wealth among nearly every child. Judges suspected forgeries, and accusations of bribery only deepened the chaos. Meanwhile, many of the wives found themselves destitute. Some estates were seized by creditors. Others were sold to cover legal fees. Women who had once lived in gilded homes now struggled to keep food on the table. A few, humiliated by the scandal, fled to other states, abandoning the Hargrave name altogether. The children fared no better. Siblings turned on one another in court, fighting for scraps of recognition. Some were reduced to pawns, used by ambitious mothers to secure influence. Others, disillusioned and embittered, walked away entirely. One son famously declared, "Let the name Hargrave rot. I want no part of it." Another was said to have destroyed family documents, ensuring certain siblings could never prove their claims. For the first time, the full scope of Edwin's obsession was undeniable to the public. What had once been whispers became common knowledge. The great steel magnate had lived not as a husband or father, but as a despot of the home, creating a brood too vast to control. His death revealed the truth. His empire was not built on unity or vision, but on fear, rivalry, and secrecy. By the end of the court battles, Hargrave's fortune was shattered. Much of it vanished into legal fees, bribes, and settlements. A handful of wives and their children secured modest inheritances, but the vast wealth Edwin had accumulated dissolved almost overnight. His steel mills survived, but his personal dynasty crumbled. The final judgment of history was merciless. Edwin Hargrave was remembered not as a titan, but as a warning. His ambition, unchecked, had consumed everything he touched, not just iron and coal, but the lives of the women and children bound to him. His empire of steel outlasted him, but his empire of flesh collapsed the moment he died. And yet, even in ruin, his story lingered. The Hargrave name became synonymous with excess, scandal, and obsession. His death had ended his rule, but it had also set loose a legacy that would echo for generations to come. After Edwin Hargrave's death and the collapse of his so-called family empire, the dust never fully settled. The lawsuits eventually faded from the newspapers. The mansions were sold off or abandoned, and the name Hargraves slipped from headlines. But whispers have a way of outliving even the wealthiest of men. In Pennsylvania towns, where his mills once thundered, locals still told stories of the Hargrave brood. Some claimed you could walk into a tavern or church and spot his descendants by their sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes, echoes of the patriarch scattered across generations. Others swore that old estates, long since fallen into ruin, were haunted not by ghosts of the dead, but by the cries of forgotten children who once lived under Edwin's iron grip. For the descendants, life was complicated. A handful embraced the name, boasting of their connection to the steel baron, insisting that his sins should not overshadow his genius. But many more rejected it entirely. Some changed their surnames, vanishing into anonymity rather than carry the shame of being tied to him. A few fled the country altogether, starting new lives in Canada or Europe, determined to bury the legacy. Historians, too, could not ignore him. While Carnegie and Rockefeller were studied as architects of industry, Edwin Hargrave became a footnote in darker chapters, mentioned not only for his contributions to steel, but as an example of unchecked obsession. Scholars debated his motives. Was he driven by lust, by ego, or by a twisted vision of immortality through bloodlines? Some painted him as a tyrant of the household, others as a cautionary tale of what happens when a man mistakes family for property. And then came the folklore. Over time, the facts of Edwin's life blurred with the legends. Rural storytellers spun tales of children wandering the woods, claiming to be Hargrave's forgotten heirs. Ghost stories grew around his abandoned estate's nannies, who swore they saw children playing in the halls long after the houses were empty, neighbors who heard wailing through shuttered windows. In some towns, parents warned misbehaving children that the Hargrave man will come for you if they didn't obey. His empire of fear had outlived him in ways he could never have planned. But perhaps the most haunting echo was not in ghost stories, but in the family tree itself. With nearly 90 children and countless grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Edwin's bloodline seeped quietly into American society. Many who bore no trace of his name carried his lineage nonetheless. Generations later, ordinary families would discover, through whispers or genealogy records, that they descended from him. Some recoiled in shame. Others leaned into the morbid fascination, telling friends they were related to the man with 31 wives and 89 children. The tragedy, of course, was that for all his efforts to multiply himself, Edwin left no true legacy of love or unity. His children inherited fragments of his fortune, but few inherited peace. His wives left stories of exhaustion and control. His empire of steel endured only because it was managed by others, stripped of his influence. The dynasty he thought he had forged dissolved into lawsuits, bitterness, and shadows. And yet, this is what makes the tale linger. Edwin Hargrave believed he could bend not just metal, but people to his will. He believed a family could be manufactured like steel beams, hammered into place, multiplied without end. But history proved otherwise. Steel endures when forged correctly. Families, however, crumble when built on fear and possession. Today, when his name surfaces, it is not spoken with reverence. It is spoken with disbelief, with fascination, with horror. How could one man attempt to build such an empire of flesh? How could he believe it would last? Perhaps that is his truest legacy. Not the mills, not the railroads, not the fleeting fortune, but the story itself. A warning etched into memory, a tale that reminds us that even the strongest empires can collapse, and that no amount of wealth or willpower can bend the human heart like iron dot, as one historian wrote years later. Edwin Hargrave forged steel for America, but he tried to forge souls for himself. And in that attempt, he left behind not a dynasty, but a curse.